Hello, do you have a specialized Tero that you'd like to make more useful by adding a rear rack? Well, so did I. And there are probably a lot of rear rack choices out there, but if you're like me, then you're considering purchasing the specialized EQ kit for the Tero, which includes not only a rear rack, but also front and rear fenders and front and rear lights that integrate in with the e-bike system as well. The specialized Tero EQ kit is not a cheap option. It currently retails for about $225. And if you're having your local bike shop install it and you're just interested to know whether it's a nice rack or not, then you don't need to watch the whole video. I'll tell you right now that it's a very nice aluminum rack. It'll support up to 27 kilograms, which is over 55 pounds worth of payload. The lights are bright and nicely integrated in with the bike. You can control them with the F1 button on the handlebars, and they go on automatically when you turn the bike on. All in all, it's fine, and I'm sure the fenders are good for keeping mud off of you as well. So if that's all you needed to know, you're on your way. If, however, you're planning on installing this kit yourself, then you might want to hang around for a bit. Installation of this kit is not for the novice. First off, if you don't own an 8mm Allen socket and a torque wrench or some sort of a bike tool for removing the crank, or if you're not comfortable getting into the motor of your e-bike, then stop now and have your bike shop install this thing. If, on the other hand, you have those tools, no specialized bicycle specific tools are needed, then carry on. I didn't consider making this video until I had embarked on this project myself and encountered some difficulties. So there's no unboxing, but it is worth looking into the box because one of the main considerations is whether or not the rear fender, light, and rack come pre-assembled or not. The instructions clearly state that they do, but mine did not. And if you've never seen how this thing goes together, I don't think it's particularly obvious. Again, I didn't consider making this video until I had already done about half the job, so I don't have a picture of all of the parts. But here are a few of the parts that I either didn't know what to do with or understood what to do with, but wasn't entirely sure how best to route the wiring, etc. All right, let's take a quick look at all the instructions before we begin. First page is just the standard legalese. Second page telling you how to remove the battery, then remove the crank and the motor cover, assemble the front fender with its center mount and stays. Then it tells you the rear rack is pre-assembled to the rear fender, which mine wasn't, which is where part of the problem occurs, but it's as simple as simply bolting the rack to the frame and then bolting the fender to the frame if it were all pre-assembled. Then plugging the wiring into the motor, running the wiring from the front light cable down through the battery box area and plugging it in, running the rear one into the bottom bracket and plugging it in, and then putting the cover and the crank back on, and you're done. Seems simple, right? Let's start by taking a look at the required tools. Like I said, if all you have is a set of Allen key wrenches and you don't have an 8mm Allen and a long breaker bar, or better yet, a torque wrench, then you're not going to be able to continue. In addition to that, having some Allen sockets is easier than working with Allen keys. You're going to need an 8mm socket if you plan to put on the rear reflector, and a 5.5mm socket for working with the nuts that attach the front fender stay to the fender. You'll need ratchets. You'll need a T10 Torx and a T20 Torx. The T10 for removing the cover for the front wiring, and the T20 for removing the motor cover. And a pair of needle nose pliers are helpful for getting the plugs in and out on the motor. And you're probably going to need a drill bit, preferably a drill bit and a step drill, but I assume that if you have a step drill, you probably have a regular drill bit as well. Personally, I'd never removed a crank on a bike like this before. Like I said, you take your 8mm Allen with your breaker bar or your torque wrench, and you hold the pedal, and it's counterclockwise, standard, normal thread, lefty-loosey, and you break it loose. And then it seems really easy and loose for a little bit. But as you continue to loosen it, it will get tight again as it's forcing the crank off of the press fit on the gear. And you'll have to kind of work your way through until the crank comes completely off. And the bolt/nut assembly will remain captive in the crank. Once you've got the crank off, you can use your T20 Torx and remove the motor cover. Easy enough. Now it's time to install the front fender. Nothing too difficult here. You sandwich the light between the fork and the tab on the fender. You use a bolt with a washer to attach it, torque it to the spec that's specified, which isn't much, 4 Newton meters, 35 inch-pounds, or, I'm not too particular about things like that. Not to crank on it, right? The rear stays show you that there's these little spacers between the stays and the fork. The kit did come with 2 of those, so I use them here. But that's going to turn out to be a problem later because we're going to be expected to have a couple of those in the back as well, and we're not going to have any left over. What the instructions skip with regard to the front fender is actually attaching the stay to the fender itself. There are 2 small bolts with nuts on. They take a 2mm Allen and a 5.5 millimeter socket for the nuts, little nylock nuts. Nylock nuts on the inside of the fender, the little bolts on the top, and the stay itself goes on the outside of the fender, not the inside. So the fender goes kind of inside the stay. Okay, here's where things get ugly, because if your kit was like mine, that statement in figure 8, the rear rack is pre-assembled to the rear fender, is not the case. So you're going to have to figure out how to assemble all this. And the wiring routing is not obvious, at least it wasn't to me anyway. Another thing that you'll find if you hold the fender up to the bike is that figure 9B that shows you bolting the fender to where normally a caliper brake would be installed in the frame, there's no hole in the fender. So you're going to have to drill your own later, but we'll get to that. There are 3 holes in the fender. 2 are obvious in that they mount to the rack, and there's one in the center between those 2, which I didn't think much of, but is actually quite important. Of course, there's also the slotted hole down at the bottom where it bolts to the bottom bracket as well. Again, assuming your kit was like mine, and this was all not pre-assembled, you'll find that you have a wiring loom for the rear light that just has 2 bare wires on it, which are nice because they can be threaded through certain areas, but are not already connected to the light. The light has 2 small holes on the end of it, and the connectors inside are push type connectors where when you push the wiring through, they will clamp on and grab. But don't do that until you've routed the wiring first. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to route the wiring through the center hole of the fender from the inside out to the top. So you take the bare wires, push them in from the inside through the hole and out the top. Then you're going to take the same bare end of the wires, and on the non-drive side of the bike, so kind of the left-hand side of the bike, of the rack, you're going to push it through the hole in the back where the light is going to plug in. So you can pre-fit the light. You'll get a feeling for where it sits, and you'll know which end has the 2 little holes in it, so you'll know which end needs the wiring. But you're going to push the wiring through there and out the back of the rack. At this point, you can actually connect the wires to the light. That's all the routing you need to do. So there's, on the end of it, there's a little plus and a little minus. Push the red into the plus and the black into the minus, and then push the light into the rack. And depending upon whether you want to install the rear reflector or not, you can either just use the 2 flat 2mm hex Allen bolts that are about 5/8 of an inch long, and you can bolt the light to the rack. Or if you're going to install the fender, then put the bracket on with the tab facing forward, so that the bracket is kind of, the tab facing backwards, so the bracket is as far forward as it would be, and you can attach it. And I suggest you install those Allen screws now, because once you put the fender on, there's not that much room to get to them. If you're putting on the reflector, then once you've got the bracket bolted into the light, then you can attach the the reflector rather, and tighten up the two 10mm nuts with the star washers that came for that. Okay, now you've got the light installed onto the rack, and you've got the wiring coming through the rack and through the fender. So now you can route the wiring along the rack. So what you do is you run it along the side, and then around the little boss, the threaded boss that's in the center bottom of the rack, and then in through the groove towards the center of the rack where that hole is going to line up for the fender. Then there's a flat piece of sheet metal that looks like a key. It's an odd shape, and that sits on top and holds the wiring in place with a hole over that threaded boss. And then there's a small, very short, I believe it's 3mm Allen bolt that you use to secure that, and that will keep the wiring in place. So again, you want to route the wiring around the little threaded boss and towards the center of the rack. Once you've got the wiring towards the center of the rack, now you can lower the fender down onto the rack. So the wire's coming out that center hole, you lower the fender down, make sure you've got it in the right orientation with the front towards the front. That's obviously the part with the slot. And you can use bolts to attach it. There is a small little plastic trapezoidal shaped piece that goes between the rack and the fender on the front side, and the bolts are different size. The front bolt takes a 4mm, and the rear bolt takes a 3mm Allen. And the holes are slotted on the fender, and personally I don't tighten them all the way, so that I have a little bit of adjustment there, and I'll tighten them later when I get around to leveling the rack. The last step to assembling this rack and fender is to take that wire and run it from the center to the non-drive side of the fender and push it into the groove that runs along the outside of the fender. You want to make sure that you put it in without any twists so that it's flat and pushed all the way in. Run your fingernail or whatever through it so that it's all the way in. You don't want it coming out. And you want to run it all the way down to the front of the fender where the slotted tab is. Okay, now your rack is pre-assembled. If you were lucky and yours came pre-assembled, then we're at the same place now. So now things are pretty simple. You take the two 5mm bolts, and when they say the adjustment washers, those are the oval shaped washers that have a hole offset on one side. Stick the oval shaped washer in the oval hole on the rack with a hole towards the front of the bike, and thread in the 5mm bolts. Of course, you don't have to tighten them right away. Allow yourself some pivot, but at least get them started. Now we come to another problem with the instructions. As you can see in pictures 9A and 9B, they show you bolting this thing in with some spacers, and I didn't get any. I only got 2 spacers. I used them on the front stays. I didn't have any spacers for the rear. Now, as it turns out, the way my fender aligned to the bike, I really didn't need a spacer at the upper mount where the brake caliper would be if it was a rim brake bike. I just used a washer there, one of the washers that came with the kit, and I happened to have a spacer laying around in the garage that was roughly a quarter of an inch or so that I used down below. You can 3D print one, you can stack some washers, you can use something that you have around the house, but go ahead and start the bottom bolt. But if, like me, you don't have a top hole in your fender for the top one, you're going to want to get this thing kind of started and in position, and then you're going to need to figure out where to drill that hole. You probably don't have to be quite as anal as I am, but I wanted to make sure that my rack was level. So at this point, I put the wheels back on the bike, I set the bike on the ground, and I put a level on the rack, and then I used blue painter's tape to identify where the fender met the frame. and marked it there. Then once I was sure that I had the right location, I removed the wheels, removed the fender and the rack, and then drilled a hole in the fender at the location that I had identified. I started with a small drill bit and then used my step drill to open it up to the appropriate size and give it a nice little chamfer on both sides. Put a little paint on the inside of the hole to prevent oxidation, and then go ahead and bolt this thing together. Again, I used a washer between the fender and the bike on the top and a spacer down below. And at this point now you can actually tighten those things up because your rack should be level. And at this point you can also tighten up the bolts that you left somewhat loose where the rack bolts to the fender. All right, now we have everything installed and it's just down to the wiring. So as the instructions say in figure 10, you need to pull out the two plugs. They're on the front and rear light sockets on the motor assembly. I found that using a pair of needle nose allowed me to grip them easier since it's kind of tight in there, but you basically just pull them out. And each one of these plugs has a different sort of key system on it, so I don't think you can plug anything into the wrong place, but I could be wrong. Okay, now we're to another area where I have a discrepancy with the manual. The manual says to use a T10 Torx key to loosen but not remove the driver side, the drive side ICR port cover. On my bike, that was not the correct side. I should have done the non-drive side. The reason is that those covers have basically two holes in them that you can run wire or hose through, and then a slot in the center. And you want to pick the side that is not using the slot in the center. The wiring from the head unit to the motor has a large plug on it and can't be run through one of those holes. So on one side of your bike, you're going to have, your rear shifter and your rear brake going through, and another side you're going to have the head unit and I don't know what is it, and the motor speed sensor or something like that. But you want to pick the side where the two lines or hoses are going through the round ports, not going through the center slotted port, because you need to use the center slotted port because your wiring has a plug on the end of it and you can't route it through one of those holes. You can kind of peek in with a light and probably see which ones are going down the two outside holes versus down the center, or you can loosen the port covers and kind of pull them out and take a look. But once you've identified the one that is not using the center slot, you want to go ahead and remove it. I know that it says to loosen but not remove the cover. I don't know. I couldn't really get the whole thing out of the frame without taking the cover completely off. But I suppose you want to make sure that you don't push the thing into the frame very far once you've removed the cover. So be careful, but you want to pull the entire assembly out of the frame. And then you can follow the instructions that they give you, in that you have to cut off that little extra tab that's in the center and run your wire through both the outside cover as well as the inside piece and push it into that center slot. Once you've got it through the cover, those two little plastic pieces, then you got to push it through the frame into the battery box area and pull it down through the battery box area and push it into the motor area, and then snap the wire into the little snappy clamps on the two brackets that are underneath there in the battery area. It's pretty obvious what you need to do. Once you've got the wire fed into the battery box area, you're going to come down from the top around the motor and down to the appropriate plug. Again, there's a picture of that on the previous page of the manual, as well as at the end of the manual that tells you which plug is which. So plug it in. You need to make sure that when you run the wiring, you don't run it in front of any of the tabs that the bolts coming through from the other side of the motor cover on, because the plastic motor cover needs to sit against those tabs. So just route it in such a way that you're not interfering with where the cover is going to bolt up. And then I took any extra length. There was a little bit of extra length and I put it up in the top of the frame in the battery area, kind of near the headset, because there's lots of room up there. Okay, so now we have to run the rear wire. They say that you have to remove the grommet from the bottom bracket. I didn't have to do that. I was able to push the plug in. There's enough, it's not that big a plug, and the hole's large enough. But whatever. Push the wiring in to the slot in the bottom bracket, and then feed it through the motor housing and plug it into the appropriate plug. Again, not interfering with any of the tabs that the motor cover is going to go up against. And that's it. I don't know. Maybe it seemed harder to me than it did to you. Hopefully this helped. At this point, you could actually test it if you put the battery back in, or you can go ahead and assume the best and bolt back on your battery cover, bolt back on your crank. Obviously, you want to offset your crank so that it's 180 degrees off of the other crank. It is not keyed. It can go in a variety of ways. So do that. When you're tightening it up, you want to tighten it up using the torque wrench. It's 50 Newton meters, which is about 36 foot-pounds if you're in America. And when you put your wheels back on, you want to tighten your axles to 30 Newton meters, which is about 22 foot-pounds. All in all, despite lousy instructions and some things that I think are inconsistent and some parts that were missing and some things that were supposed to be assembled but weren't, at the end of the day, I'm happy with it. The lights are bright, they're well integrated, and I hope that this has been helpful to you. Thanks.